Thank you very much and good afternoon. I think I'm the second last talk here, so we'll try to move things along. I'm probably going to change up things a little bit. This is an opportunity that we did some opportunity sampling along with a larger monitoring program in terms of the oil sands monitoring program. This was in collaboration with the province of Alberta, their scientists at the Alberta EPA, their new name, along with Bob Hanner and Eric Myler in there here at the University of Guelph, and Hatfield Consultants. So, I did miss it. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we acknowledge that the Territory 8 and the traditional ancestral territory of the Cree and Dene. We acknowledge that this territory is the home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta, regions 1, 4, 5, 6, and with the historical Northwest Métis homeland. In Canada, in terms of environment climate change Canada, we use environmental effects monitoring program in a way to assess how regulations protect the environment. This is primarily for pulp and paper and metal mining industry. And these are industries that discharge a treated effluent into the environment. So they, by law, they have to meet those requirements so that they meet the requirements of the Fisheries Act so they don't cause harm to fish or fish habitat. One way of evaluating this is that we use fish health as a sentinel species as a surrogate for environmental health. And in a cyclical program, this is done every 3 years, part of a fish survey as well as a benthic community survey. These methods have been adapted in the oil sands region in northern Alberta. On the mainstream, we use large body fish and small fish and more tributaries and small fish. And we look at indices of growth, maturation, and reproductive health. In the tributaries, we're restricted to using small body fish to associate health in those areas. We have identified changes in fish health in areas associated with the oil sands monitoring, so there is cause for concern. And in some areas where there is smaller tributaries moving to some of the lease sites, there's not sufficient abundance of sentinel species of fish that we normally look at, so we're using fish communities as indicators of health. And today I'm going to primarily talk about in the southern operators, where it's primarily SAGD operations. So again, there's no active mining tailings in those areas. So at those sites, there's actually limited access. You need permits to actually be on these. We're very small, first order, low order streams. Since we have kind of do an environmental monitoring blitz, we typically have crews of 4. We try to reduce the amount of variability in sampling as much as you can. There is a great deal of variability that happens with fish community assessments. So we try and spread out the experience of the crew amongst those people. I'm not even touching anything over the time. Anyway, so at each assessment, we do 150 meter stretch of the river and divide it into subsections, and there we try and get as many replicates as possible. And on site, all fish are calculated, enumerated, weighed, and then released back into the environment. And this typically we try to identify fish community habitat assessments to also try to see what's driving fish community differences in these sites. This is kind of the typical information that we're looking at. Diversity across sites and temporally and spatially. We look at similarities between sites. Then we're actually looking at potential drivers of those changes. So looking at those habitat assessment characteristics and see whether it's like slope or algae, nutrients, or potential contaminants that are causing those changes. Challenge with this approach is that it's highly intensive, personnel intensive, it's logistically challenging. Again, as mentioned, you're doing massive blitz, multiple teams, helicopters flying into these isolated locations, and you need specialized equipment that you have to maintain. And then one of the challenges is that this is a regional program, so there's over 40 small sites. So this actually happens on a 3-year cycle where we rotate through these. So it is a collaboration between the province of Alberta and Environment Canada. One of the opportunities that we have is to potentially actually collect water samples at these southern operator sites a couple years ago and see if we can start using eDNA in this monitoring program as a surrogate for the whole slew of survey. So in September 2021, we went to the southern operators around in the circles there, And we supplemented the eDNA's fish community surveys were conducted in concert with water samples were taken by the consultant who actually collected water prior to getting to the stream. They did field rep as well as a site blank at each site. At the same time, we had crews of Environment Canada in the Peace River and also in the Athabasca River as well, doing large fish surveys. So multiple teams spread out, and we took those opportunities that they're actually doing the large fish surveys for white sucker, walleye, trout perch, which is a small body fish, and from those fish they actually took fin clips that we're actually we want to look at, see if we can actually use primary comparisons for Ontario species as well. To look at primary specificity. And then that's along the main stream of Athabasca. So, getting back to our fish community assessments. So, we did the eDNA sampling alongside the river and then followed on with the ledge fishing information. So, results from the conventional data across 9 sites, cut over 400 individuals of 16 species, and one was only identified down to genus. And there's 4 fish are identified with actually no fish at all. And diversity ranged between 5 and 12 species. When we look at the eDNA analysis, we actually, these were all returned back to the University of Guelph, where they're extracted here, sent into lab services here for metabarcoding analysis, where we use the 12S and CO1 using the MetaWorks pipeline. Resulting in taxonomic assignments were analyzed using RStudio with a bootstrap threshold of 0.97 for species level matches. And then filter unique species were manually curated using FishBase database. So the conventional fishing, we found 16 unique species, and there's no, as I mentioned, there's no fish captured at 4 sites. With the 12S included 306 unique species. After filtering, that dropped to 13. And 7 of those 13 did overlap with e-fishing. 2 species were identified in MetaWorks were not in the actual database. So a minnow species and a darter. And CO1 database included 62 unique species, and that dropped to 22 after filtering. We looked at the conventional fishing at those 4 sites, group sites, where actually eDNA were collected. The eDNA actually identified between 8 and 6 species, but there's after georeferencing, some of those sites were actually dropped out. In our field blanks, we detected 4 species each time. So long-nosed sucker, lake chub, northern pike, burbot, and walleye. 5. And those are across all our sites. So we were having some kind of contamination. Those species were likely to be at some of those sites. But however, we did have georeferenced false negatives, false positives, as well as creek chub and sunfish, which aren't known to be in the area. And this is after georeferencing, actually getting rid of all the avian and mammalian references in that analysis. So we did see different distributions or presence of species identified by 12S and CO1, where there's more reliable detections at the genus level to CO1, and more detections on the species using 12S. When we look at comparisons between the two, along with e-fishing, we do see some little bit of overlap. We just considerable amount of overlap, but the ones that are not, once those are georeferenced as false positive, and once we remove those, it does reduce the amount of species actually identified by eDNA alone. So losing my spot here. So when we look at the breakdown between the two, if we did in combination, we did collect a significant amount, but again, it was only like 70% of all the species that were known to be in the area, and individually, they're only about 29% that there's some coverage. So this identified that there's a great deal of information that we weren't collecting through eDNA, whether that's from inexperience on our part, on the extraction process. So there's a great deal that we did learn from this, and we hope to improve in the future. And one of the things that we did find was a great deal of false negatives, identification of species that were not present. One of the things that we do want to make sure is that where eDNA did detect, where we didn't detect with conventional surveys, that more effort we need to go back to those sites to identify if those species are present or not. So in conversation with Bob and Erica, Erica took the charge of looking at other studies that had conventional or historic data along with eDNA. And she collated data sets from Bob's lab from these 5 different sites and identified where are potential blind spots that we're having. And this is something that she reported in her thesis, and it's too bad that she's not here to talk about it. So anyway, when she looked at, when she collated all that data, she identified by genus that there's a number of, even 12S had a number of blind spots. See, anything in black is a reliable detection, anything in gray is a blind spot. When she looked at CO1, you actually see there's more blind spots at the genus level than 12S. And we converge, we actually use both. You do see a certain amount of blind spots in that. So she turned this taxonomic blind spot, identifying spots in the pipeline where we need to identify to do more work. Potentially you're missing areas in terms of like sampling, you're not potentially sampling at the proper time, as we've seen throughout the conference today. So potentially there's a sampling blind spot, or there's a false and inefficient extraction process, inefficient preservation process. So that can happen at the sampling blind spot. Potentially you have a primary blind spot where your primary actually doesn't even annotate, or it's not conducive to your species. So maybe primary has to be designed specifically for that. When you actually get to the bioinformatics analysis, you may be able to detect something at a higher organizational level, but maybe not down to genus or species. And depending on the taxonomic assignment, that can always when you look at the different reads, something is not necessarily according into the system. And then there's potentially like a resolution blind spot. So even if a species is identified in the database, it may not be maybe some overlap in some cross reads with some other species. So these are things that we definitely need to look at in the future. Okay, so findings from this: conservative bootstrapping of 0.7 metabarcoding was still provided good but incomplete coverage with conventional methods. Metabarcoding identified plausible species in locations where eFishing did not detect. CO1 had less unique species at the genus level, taxes, but 12S was more efficient at the species level. And we found that the dual marker approach was provided greater coverage. We do need to look at how to resolve a lot of these blind spots to actually improve our coverage and our detectability and reliability of for our studies. Next step, we want to expand this to other study tributaries in the region. As I mentioned, we did collect fin clips from species that had potential partner issues, so we can send those up for Sanger sequencing to improve the resolution and improve that that sequencing. Another option for that is actually take those fin clips and actually create them into a mock community and run that mock community down the same pipeline to see if what the congruence between that information would be or not. Then we potentially need to develop test parameters for compare species between Alberta and Ontario for same species, and eventually we want to investigate the potential to measure sublethal molecular endpoints using eRNA in the system. And hopefully it's all about following up the Tau of Henry. We also work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Living Labs Initiative in Ontario and in Labo Vivant, Quebec. And this is from one of the farmers, one of our elders, is this is what he does in his pastime. He makes these fishes where the bolt at the stem is the fish are the watchers of the system, and the tools, the wrenches in the middle, they're all tools that he uses as to be a good husbandry of the land to reduce his impact in the environment. And I like to think of the tools that we're trying to develop are or trying to contribute to that as well. So thank you very much.